Thank you very much, Jan Kees and Daryl, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. I wanted to begin by saying that it's always a challenge for a professor who normally has about an hour and a half to give a lecture to be constrained to 15 minutes. And as a result, I've produced far too many PowerPoint slides. And so I'll be skipping over some of those slides for you, but I'm happy to email you the broader presentation for those of you who want the details. In fact, what I want to do is to reflect a little bit for you on our 15 years of research into certification systems in general and forest certification in particular. And so that gives me exactly 1 minute per year to review for you what we've uncovered and concluded. And so with that, I have to figure out how to work this machine. Do I just push the green button? Oh, excellent. That wasn't too hard. Okay, so I want to give you some context to my talk. First of all, I am a political scientist. And I specialize in understanding and addressing environmental and resource policies that emerge at the global, local, and domestic levels, and look at global certification or eco-labeling systems, which we refer to as non-state market-driven governance. So we take the term certification, and one of the main tasks of political scientists is to take a very simple concept like certification and make it sound much more difficult than it actually is. So we have to give more complicated names to simple phenomena. Hence, certification is non-state market-driven governance, or NSMD, which is a terrible acronym. However, we now refer to it after my colleague as NSMOID global governance. NSMOID, kind of a Star Trek kind of ring to it. So we're all involved in trying to nurture and understand NSMOID global governance, also known as certification systems. Okay? The substantive focus in my lab with my students involves a number of sectors, including forestry, climate, fisheries, mining, coffee, and agriculture. And we're now expanding to think about what this all means for palm oil certification. So you guys are all much more experts in palm oil than I am, but I want to bring to you some lessons from our work on how these other efforts have evolved to think about what it might mean for intervening to shape palm oil certification's future. And I'm going to focus a lot of my substantive comments on the case of forest certification. Okay? I also analyze and compare. So we look at how support emerges for market mechanisms and the relationship between public and private policy instruments. What are the synergies that are available, and what are the pitfalls to avoid? One important part about me is that I actually do not take sides in these certification debates. I actually instead try and analyze and ponder their implications for all of us. And as a result, everybody thinks I'm taking the other person's side, okay? And that's okay. Okay, so my motivating questions are, first of all, problem-focused. We care about understanding how policies and institutions like certification respond to and address the key environmental and social challenges of our times, including land use questions, so land allocation questions, as well as practices and stewardship questions. And we're curious about the interaction of different mechanisms, and also how different sectors interact. How does palm oil affect forestry? How does forestry affect climate, and so on? Okay, and we're very curious about the evolution of these systems. How do they grow and gain further support as time goes on? So these questions motivate my lab and our research. Okay, I want to now focus on two different kinds of motivations that we think are important for thinking about the evolution of these systems. Okay? The first is what is referred to as self-interest. We do things because it's in our individual or organizational self-interest to do. Okay? So this means that when we're looking at support for certification, we're curious about the individual and member organization's self-interest in why you would be supporting the RSPO roundtable. Again, in political science, we take simple terms and make them more complicated, so we refer to this as a logic of consequences. And this means we act because the consequences of something fit our own individual organizational self-interest. But in addition to that, we also have norms or values that also shape how we perceive and think about the world, and things that really bind us as a global community. Things like global concerns about poverty alleviation, environmental stewardship, the notions of equity, inclusion, and transparency are actually global norms that also motivate us and determine and affect how we make the choices we do. And in political science, we call this a logic of appropriateness, because some things are appropriate to support, not just because they are in our own self-interest. Okay, our approach is multidisciplinary. I'm a political scientist, but we work with and apply numerous lenses, and we collaborate. Okay? We research what has happened, but also ponder what might be in store. And as a result, we've actually created an initiative at Yale called the GEM Initiative that you can all go online to after this talk and explore in further detail. Okay? But we try and link scholarship to the practice of promoting innovative mechanisms such as RSPO. Okay, so my talk draws on many collaborations. I'm going to go over this slide really fast now, but I'll send you the email, the PowerPoint through email so you can see the details. But this is not just me talking, it's a whole group of people that have collectively and collaboratively looked at these questions. But I do want to give a shout out to Jan Case and Kira Mattis and Ruth Norris, who were part of an assessment, a multi-stakeholder assessment on global certification systems that reported just last June, and you can go to the resolve.org website to download that assessment. Okay? Especially the work on Chapter 6 on pathways that I want to, and will refer to in the remaining time that I have, which is quickly dwindling. Okay, and other collaborators as well. Okay, so now, I want you all to pretend that we're in a seminar right now, and I'm going to ponder and raise some ideas. So this is not the answers to the questions, but rather some questions for us all to collectively think about, okay? To think about some themes that have emerged in the last 15 years of research and what they might mean for addressing and promoting RSPO and the goals that it cares about. Okay, so let me first then turn to the case of forest certification, because what we've learned in the last 20 years on forest certification is that everything is always changing. Nothing stays fixed. Preferences aren't fixed. Support is not fixed. I mean, one generation ago, 20 years ago, there was actually widespread opposition on the part of most forest companies to forest certification. Okay? And now, the support has increased so much that most industrialized forest companies in North America and Europe, and many in the global south, now support forest certification. I mean, here's the chart of support for FSC certification alone from 95 to 2010. Here's the PFC support of chain of custody in just 5 years. This is a growth story in which lessons from the past need to be extrapolated to the future, and you can't assume that preferences stay the same. Okay, so if the question then is how to continue expanding certification, not assuming that what has happened will now be static, we need to ponder how to nurture increased support. Okay, so in forestry, we're curious about how we might actually gain increased traction in the tropics, where inroads are being made, but not at the same pace as in the developed world. Okay? There's a similar question for RSPO. Okay? The growth of the palm industry and the emergence of RSPO, as you all know, and we reviewed, is very important and very significant. Again, you have the same kind of growth charts as forest certification did, but still, there's much to be done, as we learned from this morning. In fact, as Professor Coe reminded us, 86% of palm oil products are not certified. So there's huge future pathways for us to ponder. Okay, so the question therefore is, what pathways might supporters of RSPO certification follow in the future? Okay? How can we link strategic decisions taken today to build tomorrow's solutions? And this is not an easy question because we know that preferences are not fixed, so you can't make decisions today based on fixed preferences. There are really two ways in which pathways can unfold. And one is a direct approach in which RSPO certification standards can directly themselves change behavior. Okay? There's also, though, the indirect approach, and that's where RSPO certification can interact with other initiatives such as government, intergovernmental agreements, and even individual firm CSR efforts. So we're curious about that interaction effort. Okay? There's a conundrum for the direct approach. So if you want to think about improving and increasing support for RSPO, we've offered a conundrum that faces most certification systems looking at addressing global, environmental, and social stewardship. The conundrum is that if you have high standards, you often get low support because the costs are higher, and therefore you often have lower impact. Okay? But likewise, if you have low standards, you might get higher support, but because you'll also get low impact. So there's a direct conundrum that supporters and nurturers of NESMOID certification systems have to tend to when trying to evolve these systems. Because of course the trick is to eventually get to the state where you have high standards, high impact, high support, and high impact. Okay? And this requires a chicken and egg approach to developing standards and market uptake so that one doesn't actually kneecap the other one. Okay? And this means that discussions about standards development cannot be developed in isolation to market uptake. Okay? They must be made in tandem with increased support in the marketplace and certified products being sold. Okay? And for example, this means we argue that much more careful attention needs to be placed on supply chain tracking, because the more supply chain tracking problems are worked out, the more you can get to consumers and customers who are demanding these products, and the more you, therefore, you can increase market benefits in line with standards. Okay, how might this be done? I'm going to provide 3 lessons from you based on our research on the direct approach. And then I'm going to skip some slides and come to sort of a conclusion about the indirect approach. Okay? First of all, the first lesson is reward the top players. Okay? And this means that you want to set standards at levels that reward, not punish, firms who are part of the RSPO process or any certification process. And what we found was, in the case of forestry, is that sometimes well-intended groups wanted to increase the standards on the most regulated companies already when they saw the need to improve certification. But the result was the firms ended up vacating the certification process because the cost became too high. So set the standard at a level where actually the top players will want to be part of your team. Okay? Now, otherwise you might actually inadvertently kneecap the system before it's had a chance to grow and emerge. The second lesson is to create a better world. And by that I mean consumers need a simpler labeling system. The success of NESMOID certification systems, including RSPO, means that consumers are confused and incapacitated. They simply are not able to understand and assess the multitude of labels out there. You need to get a single, clear label that can house, as an umbrella, all the particular certification programs. Otherwise, you lose that market uptake that is there right now, and you lose the ability to actually improve and address consumer awareness in the future. Okay, the third lesson is to weed out the bottom. And this is actually really important because efforts to weed out the worst players in the marketplace that don't even follow baseline government requirements actually may create the largest coalitions of support for NESMOID global governance. Because everybody who's at the lowest standard or above will want to be part of your coalition. And this means you're tending simultaneously to environmental group interests to actually get some impact on the ground, but also to company profits, not just forest companies, but any sector's company profits, because those that are harvesting at a level that's considered at least baseline are part of your coalition. And we refer to this in political science as coalitions of bootleggers and Baptists. Okay? And this refers to the time of alcohol prohibition in the United States, when Baptists were opposed to lifting prohibition on alcohol for moral reasons, and bootleggers for economic reasons. And the result was you had a very strong and durable coalition because they were motivated for self-interest but different reasons over the same policy instrument. And how we nurture coalitions of bootleggers and Baptists in the certification world will in large part answer whether we can move from 15% to 90 or 100%, okay? And I would argue that the example of this is the case of legality verification that's now emerging in a bunch of sectors, including mining and forestry. Legality verification is relatively modest, but it's generating a huge coalition of support in the forest sector, from developing countries to developed, to aid agencies, to environmental groups, to auditors who are collectively trying to at least provide assurances to the marketplace that baseline conditions are being met, okay? Now, the direct approach is very important, but we argue that it's missed really important indirect pathways that could also be really fruitful for certification's impacts. And this is how certification interacts with other instruments. And since I have almost no time, I'm going to briefly review for you what they actually are, the three different pathways, and get to my last slide, okay? There are essentially three pathways. One is where government supersedes, where government eventually takes over from certification. In this pathway, certification provides learning to governments and stakeholders that this actually can be done. It's a laboratory to work things out. And once worked out and learning occurs, then government can move in a way that's politically feasible. And this pathway means that you don't need to worry about the chicken and egg problem and getting 100% of the marketplace, because in fact, you're just creating a learning laboratory. And the example where this actually applies is green building council efforts now taking place in the US, where buildings are certified for being green, and then municipal building codes end up often adopting those practices when they see them actually working in practice, okay? Okay, that's one pathway. The second pathway is symbiotic, and this is when certification and government approaches remain distinct, but they reinforce each other's existence, okay? And the example is, that we give in our work is the Clean Development Mechanisms Certification Gold Standard, which emerged to fill gaps in the intergovernmental CDM mechanism. And by filling gaps, it allowed policymakers not to have to go back and rewrite and refight a hard-won international agreement, but it filled gaps through the marketplace. And this meant that the legitimacy of both the CDM and the gold standard were actually improved. So sometimes certification can act as a gap filler, which might be an easier route and also help reinforce government and not necessarily challenge it.
Fortunately, I have to ask you to wrap up, Professor.
Pardon me?
You'll have to wrap up.
Wrap up?
Yep.
Okay. That's a red. I'm past time. Okay, and the final pathway is actually a hybrid pathway. And that's where government and certification systems actually share policy functions. And the case again would be that of legality verification, where in this case, certification systems provide assurances that forest companies have met certain legal requirements that governments have set, not certification systems. But the certification bodies provide the legitimacy that this is actually taking place on the ground, and then global supply chains go up to the US and European markets in ways that actually respond to their requirements that these markets meet certification, legality, compliance, verification. In this case, you've got an interaction of EU, US policy with certification as a private mechanism helping reinforce, not challenge government standards. And so the point is that if we think more carefully about these kinds of pathways, we can better link our strategic choices to the pathways that we might be embarked and where we want to be headed. Okay, and I'll stop there. And the rest you can get if you email me the PowerPoint.